On Highway Logic, we study the strange things highways do and why they do them. Over the last few months, we've looked at split routes across Tennessee and Kentucky. Some were carved by mountains, and some by political pressure, some by towns that refuse to fade quietly from the map. And today we have another split puzzle to investigate. US-45 runs hundreds of miles through the Great Lakes to the Gulf without a single complication. That is, until it reaches Tennessee. Then, without warning, the highway divides into two full federal routes, 45 East and 45 West, running side by side for nearly 100 miles. And today we're going to take a deeper dive into why. Not because we just want to, but because you have asked for it in the comments. You know, every road has a reason, and today we're going to find that reason for 45W and 45E as we go beyond the exit. Well, welcome to Beyond the Exit. My name is Scott, and we're here to tell you the stories of the roads that move us. Now, when we look at a highway split like this, we always like to start with the same foundational questions. What would cause this split in the first place? Geography is always the first suspect. Some highways divide because the terrain leaves no alternative. But if geography doesn't explain it, well, then often we turn to look at politics. Some splits survive because the towns along them fought to keep their roots alive. Sometimes a single well-connected individual, group of them, live along that road, and that could definitely change the outcome. And if neither geography nor politics accounts for the division, we widen the search to older corridors. Indigenous trails, wagon roads, stage routes, or early transportation lines, especially railroads, which sometimes fixed a community's direction long before the pavement ever arrived. So, with these in mind, why don't we find out why US-45 decided to split in the state of Tennessee? Geography, the first suspect. Our investigation always begins with the land itself. When a highway divides because of geography, the evidence is usually unmistakable. We expect to see obstacles that physically force a route to break apart, mountain ridges too steep to cross with a single roadbed, or deep valleys that send engineers searching for separate pathways. There's also winding rivers that limit where bridges can be placed. Splits born from terrain almost always follow the contours of the landscape. In cases like our study on US-25E and 25W, the topography is the story. Ridgelines, escarpments, and narrow valleys make a single north-south corridor impossible. The land creates the fork. So we applied the same test here. We examined the elevation maps of West Tennessee, looking for features that might have dictated two different alignments. We also checked the ridges for abrupt shifts in terrain and other geological barriers that would justify sending one branch east and the other west. But on the map, the region tells a very different story. The land is open and broad and gently sloped. There are no mountains or no impassable valleys, no decisive rivers to cross. So there's no natural choke point that would force a highway to divide for nearly 100 miles. In other words, geography isn't the answer. And because the land isn't responsible for the split, our investigation has to move to its next suspect. Politics, the second suspect. If the land can't explain a divided highway, our next suspect is politics. Tennessee has a long history of communities fighting to keep their highway connections intact. A route number is more than a marker. It represents traffic, identity, and economic life. When a highway bypasses a town or it loses its federal status, the impact is usually immediate. Business often shifts and development patterns change, and local leaders take notice. That's why splits like 11E and 11W, or 31E and 31W, weren't shaped by geography at all. They survived because the communities along them insisted that no one branch could simply disappear. When we started digging, we did find that there was some tension that came to head in the 1930s, when the American Association of State Highway Officials pushed states to eliminate split route designations nationwide. In 1934, Tennessee, along with a handful of others, was urged to consolidate its divided routes into single numbers to reduce driver confusion, but the state refused. The towns along these corridors relied too heavily on their highway identity, and removing a number was often seen as removing their place on the map. Tennessee argued that in many regions, no single corridor could realistically serve everyone. The result was a quiet standoff. The national standards said one thing, Tennessee held its ground. and the split route remained. Yet, this information wasn't very helpful in our investigation. I mean, we do understand why US 45W and US 45E are still around today, but we still don't know why they split in two. So, with geography and politics unable to give us a complete answer, our investigation has to move on to the next suspect. Legacy corridors, the third suspect. When a highway traces the footprint of an older corridor, the history usually shows up in the towns along it. Early communities often formed along the routes that carried people and goods long before the numbered highway system existed. These would include stage roads, market paths, military routes, or later transportation lines that shaped settlement patterns. So the question in our investigation has to be, did the state highway officials inherit two routes? Well, along the western route, the towns of Humboldt, Trenton, Dyer, and Rutherford and Union City form a steady line of towns running north toward Kentucky. Along the eastern route, Medina, Milan, Sharon, and Martin create a parallel chain with its own rhythm and local identity. They predate the highway. Somehow, there was a pathway through here before all that. Were there older routes through here? Well, sure, all of them. Indigenous paths, wagon lines, stage roads were all here, but they aren't really what shaped this split. We don't find evidence that they influenced it at all. And that left just one last clue on the table, our real culprit. Our final suspect. So now we have to turn to our last segment, engineered systems that came before modern roads. And here is what the research points to. When railroads pushed into West Tennessee, two major companies were competing for a north-south corridor. One was the Mobile and Ohio, and the other was the Illinois Central, and they couldn't share a single alignment. Each line needed its own right-of-way, its own grades, and its own buildable paths. So engineers for both railroads had to find corridors with stable soil, workable ridges, and gentle enough slopes to lay track. In this section of Tennessee, that didn't produce two adjacent routes, but two separate routes. Once those lines were established, then the towns made their commitment. Communities negotiated for depots, invested in the corridor they landed on, and oriented their business districts and travel patterns around whichever railroad served them. And once a town tied itself to a line, that decision was pretty much permanent. Their economy, movement, and identity followed that corridor for generations. And this is the moment where investigation lines up. It was the railroad era that locked the region into two separate corridors, two competing railroads, two buildable paths, and two sets of towns that grew along them. So when US 45 arrived, it inherited them. The region wasn't divided by the highway was divided because the railroad had already built it. And as we said before, every road has a reason, and with 45W and 45E, I think we found it. Well, I hope you enjoyed our story today. Here on Highway Logic, we love looking at the oddities in America's roads and trying to understand why they move the way they do. If you've got a story about 45W and 45E, or any other road you think we should cover, I'd love to hear it. You can just drop it in the comments below. We stay very engaged there. You know, here at Beyond the Exit, we love telling the stories of the roads that move us. And if that's something you enjoy too, I'd invite you to join us on this caravan and subscribe to the channel. Hey, and if you like this video, if you wouldn't mind clicking that like button, that would be super helpful. That or sharing it with someone else who might appreciate it. It really helps us go a lot further on YouTube. We also know there are plenty of other places that you could spend time on YouTube. So we want to thank you for stopping in and spending time with us. And as always, we want to say thank you and God bless.